Hi again, this is Aleph. I wanted to talk about Richard Dawkins for a little while. He influenced me a lot in my atheism, in my fascination for evolution, in my style of rhetoric. However, he disappointed me greatly with his book The God Delusion. What he calls the central argument of his book is a patently invalid argument. Even if you grant all the premises, the conclusion does not follow. Here is the argument for those who have not seen it.
This chapter has contained the central argument of the book, and so, at the risk of sounding repetitive, let's summarize it as a series of 6 numbered points.
1. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect over the centuries has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. 2. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. In the case of a man-made artifact such as a watch, the designer really was an intelligent engineer. It is tempting to apply the same logic to an eye or a wing, a spider or a person. 3. The temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. The whole problem we started out with was the problem of explaining statistical improbability. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable. We need a crane, not a skyhook, for only a crane can do the business of working up gradually and plausibly from simplicity to otherwise improbable complexity. 4. The most ingenious and powerful crane so far discovered is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Darwin and his successors have shown how living creatures, with their spectacular statistical improbability and appearance of design, have evolved by slow, gradual degrees from simple beginnings. We can now safely say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that, an illusion. 5. We don't yet have an equivalent crane for physics. Some kind of multiverse theory could in principle do for physics the same explanatory work as Darwinism does for biology. This kind of explanation is superficially less satisfying than the biological version of Darwinism because it makes heavier demands on luck. But the anthropic principle entitles us to postulate far more luck than our limited human intuition is comfortable with. 6. We should not give up hope of a better crane arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. But even in the absence of a strongly satisfying crane to match the biological one, the relatively weak cranes we have at present are, when abetted by the anthropic principle, self-evidently better than the self-defeating skyhook hypothesis of an intelligent designer.
If the argument of this chapter is accepted, the factual premise of religion, the God hypothesis, is untenable. God almost certainly does not exist.
And here is William Lane Craig's critique of the argument. And yes, I know he has a pompous voice, but he happens to be right on this one.
That the conclusion, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, just doesn't follow from these 6 steps. Even if you concede that every one of them is true and justified, it doesn't follow that God doesn't exist. Well, what does follow from these 6 steps of Dawkins' argument? At most, all that follows is that we shouldn't infer God's existence on the basis of the appearance of design in the universe. In other words, we shouldn't believe in God's existence on the basis of design in the universe. But of course, that conclusion is quite compatible with God's existence, or even with justifiably believing in God's existence. Maybe we should believe in God's existence on the basis of a cosmological argument, or an ontological argument for God's existence, or a moral argument for God's existence.
1. Now Richard Dawkins is not a logician, so it is understandable that he would make mistakes like this. However, I know for a fact he does know some information theory. And I think beneath his invalid argument there is a powerful, logically valid argument against God's existence, and it just needs a little formalization to get there. Take his first statement. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the improbable appearance of design in the universe arise. Notice how Dawkins introduces a few concepts. The concept of an explanation and the concept of the improbable appearance of design. Philosophers have a very hand-wavy and informal way of deciding what is the best explanation for something. Craig explains.
Simplicity is just one of the criteria that scientists use in assessing competing hypotheses. Even more important than simplicity will be things like explanatory power, for example, explanatory scope. There will also be things like the degree of ad hocness, the degree to which this is contrived or artificial, its plausibility, and so forth. So that simplicity is just one of an array of criteria that must be balanced against each other in order to assess competing hypotheses. And some hypothesis may be less simple than another, but have much greater explanatory scope or explanatory power, and therefore be preferable despite its being less simple. You cannot simply dismiss a hypothesis on the grounds of simplicity without weighing it in conjunction with these other criteria.
As you can see, we are told there are several criteria for choosing between competing explanations, but Craig does not bother to define formally any of them. Further, we are not told how to weigh them against one another. In order to make sense of this formally, we need to think about explanation in terms of information compression. So in terms of the criteria Craig laid out, simpler, less ad hoc explanations are better because they make fewer claims, and therefore they have a higher prior probability, and thus achieve greater information compression. The claim's explanatory scope and power can be understood as the number of propositions the claim can account for, and thus how much information it compresses. Similarly, the criterion of plausibility appeals to the prior probability of the explanation. Now, improbably complex things are information-rich and they have a high entropy by the standard definitions of information theory. One of the greatest challenges in the human intellect is to compress the information we see around us. So for example, Darwin compressed the information contained in living creatures to a relatively simple computer program, namely a genetic algorithm. Or, the Standard Model compresses the observable information we have about the universe in terms of fundamental particles and the laws governing their interaction. Darwin's genius comes from the fact that he compressed so much information. Just like Dawkins says in his fourth point. Now take Dawkins' second and third statements, where he says that we are not justified in inferring design because we are left with the further question of who designed the designer. And take a look at William Lane Craig's response.
In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. This is a very elementary point in philosophy of science concerning inference to the best explanation. For example, if archaeologists digging in the earth were to discover artifacts resembling tomahawks and arrowheads and pottery shards, they would certainly be justified in inferring that these were not the result of the chance processes of sedimentation and metamorphosis, but were rather the products of intelligent design. They were crafted by intelligent agents, and that explanation would be the best even if they had absolutely no idea who these people were or where they came from. Or again, imagine that astronauts going to the moon were to discover on the dark side of the moon a pile of machinery on the moon. Clearly, they would be justified in inferring that this is the result of some sort of intelligent agency, perhaps extraterrestrial intelligent life. And that inference would be the best even if they had no explanation whatsoever of who these agents were or where they came from or how they got to the backside of the moon.
Craig is of course right that to recognize an explanation is the best, you do not need an explanation of the explanation. What I am saying is that to recognize an explanation is the best, it should achieve the greatest information compression. Regarding the archaeologists that infer intelligent design, they know with high probability as part of their background knowledge that humans exist and that they make tools, so said explanation does achieve information compression because it appeals to propositions we know with high probability. Similarly, if we infer alien technology, it is because we know the kinds of entities that can develop technology already exist in the universe once, that is us, and may do so in other planets. But a problem arises when you try to use an omniscient being as an explanation for the universe, or indeed, anything. Because an omniscient being is the most complex, information-rich, high-entropy thing imaginable. It literally encodes all the possible information. Notice how Craig disagrees with this.
I think the more fundamental mistake that Dawkins makes is his assumption that a divine designer is just as complex as the contingent universe. And I think that's clearly false. As an unembodied mind, God is a remarkably simple entity. As a non-physical entity, a mind is incredibly simple because it has no parts. A mind isn't composed of different parts to be a composition. And as for the salient properties of a mind, things like self-consciousness, rationality, and volition, well, those are essential to a mind. A mind could not lack those properties and still be a mind. So in contrast to the contingent and variegated universe with all its different properties and constants and quantities and inexplicable appearances of design, a divine mind is startlingly simple. Certainly, such a mind may have complex ideas. That's true. This mind might be contemplating the infinitesimal calculus, which is a very complex idea. But the mind itself is a very simple entity, being an immaterial entity not composed of parts. Dawkins has, I think, evidently confused a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is really an incredibly simple entity. And therefore postulating a divine mind behind the variegated and contingent universe most certainly does represent a considerable advance in the simplicity of one's explanation for whatever that might be worth.
But that is where Craig is wrong. It is impossible for an information processing system like a mind to be less complex than the information it processes, since Shannon's source coding theorem requires a minimum number of bits of memory to encode any losslessly compressed information. Notice how this is not contingent on the mind being physical, material, in space, or even in time. This theorem follows logically and necessarily from the very rules of deductive logic William Lane Craig uses to formulate his arguments. So he must change his view that a mind is a simple entity on pain of irrationality. Craig's claim that a simple mind can grasp complex ideas is also preposterous when you consider differences in ability between minds. How does he think human minds are different from God's mind? Clearly, if there is a God, his mind must be more complex than ours, and that would be why he would have more knowledge than us. Consider also a neural network. Does Craig think a simple mental model with a dozen parameters is capable of entertaining ideas as complex as ChatGPT with its billions of parameters? Now, take Dawkins' last 2 points, which basically say God is not a good explanation for the apparent design of the universe. Here I wish Dawkins had mentioned the second law of thermodynamics. Given that we have established that a personal mind is an information-rich high-entropy system, and given that we know from the second law of thermodynamics says entropy always increases over time, it looks like the existence of an omniscient being that has been there from the beginning of the universe contradicts the second law of thermodynamics. I will let Richard explain.
This is a nice quote from Arthur Eddington. He said, "If somebody points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation."
Now you may say God is outside the universe and not in it, so the entropy of the universe could increase while God stayed the same. However, if this were the case, then God could not act in the universe, because as soon as we give him any ability to, say, open and close a hole on a wall between two sealed rooms, then he would be able to violate the second law of thermodynamics in our universe by creating a temperature differential without expending energy. This is of course the famous Maxwell's demon thought experiment. So Dawkins' argument perhaps ought to look something like this. 1. Anything that is incompatible with the second law of thermodynamics almost certainly does not exist. 2. The existence of God, an omniscient creator of the universe who has any causal power in the universe, is inconsistent with the second law of thermodynamics because an omniscient being is an information-rich high-entropy entity. 3. Therefore God almost certainly does not exist. And you might also add that this is also why God is not a good explanation for anything, because good explanations compress information, whereas postulating a God only increases the amount of information to be compressed or explained. What do you think of the revised version of the argument? Did I do better than Dawkins? Could the simpler minds in your high school understand calculus like William Lane Craig claims? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe and donate so I can keep making videos.